Most people think wealth grows in a straight line. It does not. It grows like a heavy flywheel. At the beginning, you push and almost nothing happens. You push again and it still looks unimpressive. You push for months, sometimes for years, and if you are not careful, you start to feel foolish. Then one day the wheel begins to carry part of its own weight. A little later it begins to pull, and if you stay with it long enough, you eventually reach the point where the wheel is generating more force than your hands ever could. That is how I have always thought about money. Not as a lottery ticket, not as a dramatic trade, not as a life that changes because you got clever for 1/4 as a flywheel. And there are 3 moments in that flywheel that change everything. I do not mean emotionally, I mean mechanically. The first moment is when you stop being a person with a good intention and become a person with actual invested capital. The second moment is when the machine begins to help you in a way you can finally feel. The third moment is when work stops being your only engine, because your capital has become an engine of its own. That is what most people never understand about building wealth. They think the hard part is finding the right stock. It is not. The hard part is surviving the stage where effort is visible and results are still too small to impress anybody, including you. That is where most people quit. I have spent my life around capital, and I can tell you with great confidence that the beginning is supposed to feel slow. The system is not broken because it feels unfair in year 1. It feels unfair because in year 1 you are still doing almost all the work. That is the first truth. At the beginning, you are the engine, not the market, not the portfolio. You are the one earning. You are the one sacrificing. You are the one making the contribution. You are the one declining the extra trip, the extra purchase, the extra excuse. You are the one placing small amounts of money into a machine that still has almost no momentum. And because that stage is emotionally awkward, people begin to invent dangerous stories. They tell themselves it is too little to matter. They tell themselves they will start later when they earn more. They tell themselves it makes no sense because the account hardly moved. They tell themselves they have plenty of time. Then 20 years pass, and they discover that what they lacked was never intelligence. It was respect for thresholds. That is why I want to talk to you about the 3 net worth milestones that matter. Not because the numbers are mystical, but because they mark the points where the flywheel changes speed. The first threshold is 10,000. That number is not exciting to people who confuse wealth with display. To me, it is one of the most important numbers in the whole journey. Why? Because 10,000 proves something that cannot be bought from the outside. It proves that you can build capital, not dream about it, not talk about it, not admire it in somebody else. Build it. The difference between 0 and 10,000 is not just arithmetic. It is identity. 0 to 10,000 is where you move from consumer to owner. And that identity flip matters more than most people realize. A person with 0 invested capital usually still thinks about money as something that arrives and leaves. Paycheck comes in, bills go out, a little guilt sits in the middle, life happens around the edges. A person who crosses 10,000 has begun doing something structurally different. He has interrupted that cycle. He has taken labor and converted part of it into stored ownership. That is not a small thing. At the start of the journey, nearly all the visible progress comes from your contributions, not your returns. That is why it feels slow and why people get discouraged. If you are putting away $50 a month or $200 a month or $500 a month, then for quite a while the blue part of the chart is almost all you. The green part, the part everyone wants to brag about, the compounding, is still a thin line. But the thin line is there. That is what people miss. Compounding is not absent in the beginning. It is simply quiet. I learned early in life that quiet things are often the most valuable. A thin green line that is allowed to keep growing is worth far more than a thick blue line that eventually stops because you lost faith in the machine before it had momentum. That is why 10,000 matters. It is the threshold where compounding stops being a theory and becomes a living mechanism inside your account, even if it is still a small one. Let me say it another way before 10,000. You are mostly proving discipline. At 10,000, you begin proving repeatability. And repeatability is the real mother of wealth. Anybody can save once. Very few people can install a habit strong enough to survive boredom. That is why I am less impressed by one heroic year of saving than by a person who can make small contributions month after month until an account balance begins to take on a life of its own. Now, I want to tell you something that I think should comfort people who feel embarrassed by how small the beginning looks. The first 10,000 is supposed to feel underwhelming. You are not failing if it feels underwhelming. You are pushing the flywheel. And the flywheel at that stage is still heavy. People compare the first threshold to the third and feel ashamed. That is like insulting a seed because it is not a tree yet. A seed has a different job. Its job is not to provide shade. Its job is to survive, root, and prove life has begun. 10,000 is rooting capital. That is why it changes everything. It also changes your psychology in a way the spreadsheets do not capture. Once you have built 10,000, you stop wondering whether you are capable of investing and start asking how far this can go. That may sound subtle. It is not subtle. That is how self-sustaining behavior begins. A person who doubts his ability to do the thing is fragile. A person who has evidence that he can do the thing becomes dangerous. That is the emotional dividend of the first threshold. Now let me make something very clear about speed, because there are faster ways to reach this threshold than people think. Tax advantages matter. Employer matches matter. Retirement contributions matter. The government, in many systems, will subsidize disciplined behavior more generously than it will subsidize almost anything else in your financial life. And yet millions of people ignore that because the benefit is not visible in the same emotionally immediate way as a purchase. That is foolish. If an employer offers a match, that is not just free money in the childish sense, it is an acceleration of the flywheel. If a tax-advantaged account allows gains to compound without the normal friction, that is an acceleration of the flywheel. If your retirement contribution is being boosted by tax relief or by your employer, you are not simply saving, you are buying speed. I have always liked buying speed when the price is favorable. The first threshold can take a long time if you insist on doing everything with one hand tied behind your back. It arrives much sooner when you use the structures available to you. That is not gaming the system. That is respecting the rules of the machine. Now let us move to the second threshold, because this is where the story becomes much more interesting. The second threshold is 100,000. This is where a person's relationship with money changes from effort to acceleration. I want you to notice the word I used, not completion. Acceleration 100,000 is not enough for most people to retire, and pretending otherwise is how silly financial conversations begin. But it is often enough for the machine to stop feeling decorative and start feeling powerful. That is what matters. At 100,000, compounding is no longer a quiet assistant hiding behind your own contributions. It begins to speak loudly enough that you can hear it. A normal market year on 100,000 can produce the kind of growth that a beginner once had to save for with months of effort. Not because you became a genius overnight, but because the flywheel now has enough mass that motion is producing visible motion. That is a very different experience. The person with 10,000 still feels responsible for nearly everything. The person with 100,000 begins to notice that the portfolio is now capable of having good months without his direct labor. That changes how you walk through the world. You stop seeing wealth as a fantasy for rich people and start seeing it as a machine you are actively feeding. That is why 100,000 is one of my favorite thresholds. It proves that your money can now help. That does not mean you stop. In fact, one of the great mistakes people make at this stage is that they finally see the machine working and then they get lazy, distracted, or overconfident. I have seen that happen. They hit 6 figures, congratulate themselves, and begin treating the account like a mature tree when it is still a fast-growing sapling. That is not wise. 100,000 is the point where the wheel begins to help you. It is not the point where you stop pushing. Still, the mechanical change is real. Once you reach 6 figures, every future milestone tends to arrive faster than the previous one did, assuming you do not sabotage the process. That is because a larger base can compound more aggressively. The first 100,000 is slow because you are building mass. The second comes faster because mass is already there. The third faster still. This is one reason wealthy people often sound strange when they talk about money. They are living in a part of the curve where the machine is doing far more of the visible work. The beginner hears that and feels inferior. He should not. He should understand what curve he is on. That is the real lesson. At 100,000, many people also discover something else. They realize they do not actually need to be all or nothing about the journey. The portfolio has enough momentum that life can breathe a little. That is where people begin encountering ideas like coasting. I am not telling you that everybody should stop contributing after 6 figures. That would be absurd and situation dependent. I am telling you that 6 figures proves you are no longer building from scratch. That matters enormously. It means if life requires a pause, the machine does not die. It means if you redirect effort toward another goal for a while, the wheel is still turning. It means time has become an ally instead of just a calendar. That is a huge psychological shift. When I think about 100,000, I think about transfer of labor. At the beginning, every meaningful dollar in the account carries your fingerprints. By the time you reach 6 figures, a larger and larger share of the future growth will come from past discipline rather than fresh exertion. That is exactly how capital is supposed to work. It is supposed to store your old discipline and deploy it later when you are sleeping, traveling, working, thinking, or simply living. That is the elegance of it. You do the work once. Capital keeps remembering. Now I want to talk about the temptation that appears around this threshold because it is a sneaky one. Once people get to 6 figures, they often start looking sideways. They compare themselves to someone with $500,000. They compare themselves to someone with real estate. They compare themselves to someone who got lucky in crypto. They compare themselves to a person who inherited capital. Comparison is poison at this stage because it blinds you to the real miracle that has already occurred. You are now inside the acceleration zone. The account is not just a storage box anymore. It is an engine. Do not insult your own engine because another man's engine is larger. Feed yours. That is the rule. The second threshold also introduces a deeper question, and I want to answer it honestly. Is 100,000 enough to change your life? In one sense, yes. In another sense, not yet. It changes your life because it changes your trajectory. That is more important than most people think. A person on the right trajectory can become unimaginably better off with time. A person on the wrong trajectory can earn more and still drift. 6 figures invested is proof of trajectory. It is proof that the future can now arrive faster than the past prepared you to expect. But it is not yet full freedom. For that, we need the third threshold, and the third threshold is 100,000. This is where the conversation becomes serious in a new way, because this is a stage where money begins to make an amount of money large enough to rival labor income. That is not magic. It is still the flywheel. It is simply a much heavier wheel. $1 million invested at an 8% return does not merely grow. It can generate annual figures that start to feel like a salary. In many years, the growth on that capital will exceed what ordinary households earn from full-time work. That is why this threshold changes everything. It is where capital stops being a helper and becomes a second engine, powerful enough to alter the meaning of work itself. I want to be careful here because this is where people become sloppy with language. $1 million is not infinite. $1 million is not luxury in every city, in every family structure, under every tax regime, in every market environment. But $1 million is very often the first level at which labor becomes optional in a meaningful sense, especially if the household understands spending and understands withdrawal discipline. That is where ideas like the 4% rule enter the conversation. Now, I have always distrusted rules that people repeat without context, but I do respect the underlying logic. The point is not that you can blindly withdraw a particular percentage and stop thinking. The point is that once your invested capital reaches a sufficiently large base, there are reasonable rates at which you may be able to draw from that capital while allowing the underlying engine to continue functioning over long periods. That is the important change. Your life is no longer held up by work alone. Capital is holding a larger share of the roof. That changes your bargaining power with the world. And bargaining power is one of the great hidden luxuries in life. A man with no capital must ask what work he can get. A man with real capital can ask what work is worth doing. A man with no capital must tolerate things for longer than he should. A man with real capital can say no sooner. A man with no capital thinks in monthly survival. A man with real capital can think in decades. That is why 100000 is not just a number. It is a freedom threshold. It is the point where you have a chance, if you are sensible, to stop organizing your life entirely around the necessity of earned income. But do not misunderstand me. This third threshold is not a finish line in the childish sense. It is a role change. At 10,000, you are proving you can build. At 100,000, you are proving your capital can accelerate. At 1000000, you are proving that capital can begin carrying your life with you rather than behind you. That is different. And because it is different, the mindset must change again. Most people spend the journey trying to arrive. Very few people know how to manage arrival. Arrival requires a different kind of intelligence. You must understand spending. You must understand sequence risk. You must understand the difference between paper wealth and spendable wealth. You must understand taxes. You must understand that markets do not owe you smooth returns every year simply because you reached a satisfying number on a screen. This is where the amateurs who dreamed of escape often get exposed. They believe the number would do all the thinking for them. Numbers do not think. People do. That is why even at this third threshold, discipline still matters. In some ways, it matters more. A million badly handled is not freedom. It is a delayed problem. A million handled with respect becomes one of the great turning points a normal person can ever reach. Now, I want to talk about the long middle because that is where most of life is actually lived. People love milestones because milestones are emotionally tidy. They break the journey into meaningful chapters. I understand that, but wealth is not built at the milestones. It is built in the years between them. It is built in the boring months. It is built when no one is praising you. It is built when the chart looks unimpressive. It is built when markets are down and the world is noisy and your contribution still leaves the account looking almost unchanged. That is the real test. The first threshold teaches patience. The second teaches faith in the machine. The third rewards endurance. And the whole journey requires one trait above almost all others: consistency. You do not need to be brilliant. You do not need to pick 10 perfect stocks. You do not need to predict recessions. You do not need to be early on every trend. You need to contribute. You need to protect the compounding process. You need to avoid sabotaging the machine. That is harder than people think because the world is built to interrupt the machine. There will always be a reason to delay. Your friends will want to spend. Your salary will rise and your lifestyle will try to expand with it. The market will scare you. The market will tempt you. You will feel behind. You will feel bored. You will feel as though it is taking too long. All of those feelings are normal. None of them deserve the wheel. That is one line I wish more people understood. Your feelings do not deserve the flywheel. The flywheel deserves consistency. This is why I have always liked automatic contributions, tax-advantaged accounts, retirement plans, and systematic investing. They turn psychology from an enemy into a bystander. The more you can remove your day-to-day moods from the compounding process, the more likely you are to survive long enough to see the milestones do their work. A person who waits to feel inspired will lose to a person who automates almost every time. And I want to say something else that matters, especially to younger people. Do not insult small starting numbers. That is how you talk yourself into never starting. If you can only invest $50 a month, then do not spend 6 years being ashamed of 50. Start the machine with 50. If you can invest $200 because your employer is matching part of it, then use that structure. If you are in a tax advantage system, use it. If you have access to a retirement plan with free acceleration built in, use it. I have never been impressed by people who refuse to start because the beginning was not dramatic enough for their ego. Ego is expensive. Start anyway. There is another identity shift here that I think matters. At the beginning, you feel like a saver. That is a weak identity if you stop there. By the time you cross 10,000, you are an investor. By the time you cross 100,000, you are an allocator of growing capital. By the time you cross 1000000, you are a manager of freedom. That is the full progression. Saver to investor, investor to allocator, allocator to steward of freedom. Each threshold changes not just what the money can do, but who you must become to deserve what the money can do. That is why the milestones matter so much. They are not merely numbers, they are developmental stages in the relationship between labor, capital, and identity. I have always believed that real wealth does not just buy nicer things, it buys time, choice, and emotional room. The reason the million threshold is so powerful is not because it guarantees yachts and applause. It is because it introduces a world in which the compounding on your capital can begin buying back your time. And time, unlike money, cannot be replenished by rates of return. That is why it matters. Now let me speak to the person who feels stuck near the beginning, because that is the person most in danger of quitting. You look at your account, you see the small green line, you see how much effort the blue line required. You think this is ridiculous. You think I am doing all the work. You think I could use this money. Now, of course you could. That is exactly why the journey is hard. Delayed gratification sounds noble in books. In real life, it feels inconvenient, repetitive, and often lonely. But the people who reach the second and third thresholds are not superhuman. They are people who understood one critical truth. The first phase always feels unfair. That is not evidence you should stop. That is evidence you have entered the phase correctly. When the flywheel is still heavy, your job is not to admire it. Your job is to push. Then push again, and again. That is the entire game. The reason most people never experience the tipping points is not that the tipping points are fake. It is that people leave the table a few turns before the machine would have begun proving itself. I think about that often. How many lives are dramatically smaller because perfectly smart people mistook the slow stage for the useless stage? How many people sold at 8,000 because 10,000 looked too far? How many coasted emotionally at 60,000 and never saw what 100,000 would have done to their confidence? How many reached 250,000 and then started treating the portfolio like an entertainment device instead of a freedom machine? How many people got close to the million threshold and then let lifestyle inflation eat the pace that discipline had built? This is why I like milestones. They protect the mind from vagueness. They say stay with the wheel until here, then stay until here, then stay until here. That gives people something they can hold. And when they hold it long enough, the machine begins holding them. That is the reward. Before I finish, I want to say something about living your life along the way, because people often swing too far. They hear compounding and think life must be postponed indefinitely. I do not believe that. Money is a tool. It is meant to support a life, not replace one. If you build wealth but arrive exhausted, disconnected, and unable to enjoy the freedom you purchased, then you misunderstood the assignment. But there is a difference between enjoying life and consuming the future for relief. One is wise, the other is expensive. The right balance is not found by abandoning the machine every time the present asks for comfort. It is found by building a life where the machine is protected and the present is still allowed to be human. That is why I do not want you worshiping the milestones. I want you respecting them. 10,000 means you can build. 100,000 means the machine can help. 1 million means the machine can begin carrying a meaningful share of your freedom. That is the progression. That is the flywheel. That is the real story behind wealth. Not magic, not luck, not a trick math. Patience, and the willingness to stay in the room long enough for the thresholds to change your life. If you remember only one thing from me, remember this: wealth does not feel powerful at the start because you are still supplying all the power. Stay with it. The wheel gets heavier before it gets faster, and once it gets faster, everything changes.